Today, I die. But do not grieve for me, for I no longer fear death. He who has stalked me for so long now. Oh, it's not as I said to Master Kingston, that I desire death, but rather the grim inevitability of my fate has caused me to become reconciled with it. I have made my peace with God, and now my spirit yearns to be free of this cruel and unjust world. Within the hour, I will gladly walk to the scaffold, and if I'm lucky, I will not feel the cold steel of the sword of Calais cleave my head from this sinful body. Oh, but I have not sinned as they say I have. Well, at least not in this lifetime. I stand before you, accused and convicted of treason, incest, and adultery. Oh, this suits their purpose well enough. Cromwell, to save his own skin, by annihilating not only me and my brother, but those who have lived and loved for the name and honour of Anne Boleyn. And Henry. So that he may indulge his changing passions and take Mistress Seymour for his new wife. Oh, but to my God I confess different sins. For in this lifetime I have been cruel and spiteful to Catherine and the Lady Mary. Oh, in my wild and unbridled jealousy, I have lashed out, making their lives a misery. Even encouraging Lady Shelton to degrade and humiliate Mary for her defiance of me and my marriage to Henry. Oh, I did not honour her high birth or her loyalty to her mother. When how could I have blamed her? I could have no more dishonoured my own mother if our situations had been reversed. For this cruelty, oh, I truly repent. But there is even more than they know. For this is a strange story indeed, beyond all imagining. You see, I no longer know who I truly am. Time and my real identity has become distorted. But I do know this, though, that I have been living in a dual reality that has spanned times and lifetimes. In the mirror, I see myself as Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. Oh, yet in consciousness, I know that I've been living another life, in another lifetime. I do not know how this has been happening, or why me. But I do know that I've been living another life, 500 years into the future. And in that lifetime, I am just plain Anne. Oh, but even this Anne has sinned wretchedly. I have watched both my lives become inextricably entwined, each reality reflecting and shaping the other. Oh, I've tried. Oh, dear Lord, I have tried to stop it all, to change the outcome. Oh, but it has been a fruitless quarry. And I have watched both my lives hurtle headlong towards disaster. I have tasted, drunk from the cup of poison that is fate, and now I surrender to her will. Surely now with my death, soul. Take me now. I am ready to be free. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Didn't expect that. Maybe my thespian career awaits. Thank you so much for coming here this evening. Welcome to Subley. It's a real delight to see you. I recognise some familiar faces, but lots of new friends. So my name, if you haven't gathered, is Sarah Morris. I'm not Amberlynn, just in case you were wondering. Sarah Morris, and I'm the author of Temps Viendra, Novel of Anne Boleyn, also known affectionately as LTV for short, just in case I break out into an acronym at some point. What I'm going to be doing is talking to you for about 45 minutes or so this evening about a subject, of course, which is very dear to my heart. And then there'll be time at the end for questions. Just to clear up any confusion, you just heard the prologue from the novel, from LTV, and we hear from Anne herself in the Tower shortly before her execution on the 19th of May, 1536. And the prologue gives us a flavour of the story. We hear about how, in its essence, there is a modern-day heroine who's in love with all things Tudor and Amberlynn, who gets drawn back in time and finds herself in the body of her historical heroine, Amberlynn. We start to get a little flavour of how she walks in Anne's footsteps from the heady romantic days, early days of the romance with Henry, through to her dramatic downfall in May 1536. We also hear a little bit about the parallel lives love story of these two women. So we have two women separated by 500 years, and yet we start to get a glimpse of how their lives, their loves and their relationships are inextricably entwined, each one reflecting and shaping the other. So this is in essence the story of LTV, of Temps Viendra. And in thinking about what we were going to talk about tonight, I was pondering over what do I get asked quite a lot. And one of the questions that people do ask with a degree of excitement, particularly PR companies who want to promote you, is, did you find anything out new about Anne Boleyn? And this always raises a rather wry smile for me. Because I suppose it depends on how you define new exactly. And I guess that depends on perspective. So, yes, what I wanted to talk to you about tonight was my process of writing and some of the things that I believe actually I have uncovered about Anne Boleyn. Now, I would just hold my hands up and say that I'm not a professional historian. That's not how I set out to write this novel. In fact, I never set out to write this novel. It kind of happens to me by chance, as some of the best things do in life, I think. I am rather a very passionate and enthusiastic amateur, and a bit like the modern-day heroine, very much in love with all things Tudor and Anne Boleyn. And I did not, therefore, actually set out when I began to write LTV to dust off my medieval Latin. Hello, Richard, and my medieval Latin translation background. I did not dust off my medieval Latin. I really wanted to. Well, this was my purpose in writing LTV, and it was quite selfish actually to begin with. I wanted to get behind Anne's story, the well-known story we all know, boy meets girl, girl meets boy, boy passionately pursues girl, then rents the country apart, breaks the links with Rome and sends her off to the scaffold on charges of judicial murder, in my humble opinion, that everyday love story that we all know and love so well. Well, I kind of had a hankering to get beneath that story, to get really up close and personal with Anne Boleyn, and to follow in her footsteps. I think, like any lover of history, we often have a yearning to what would it be like if just for a few moments I could follow in somebody's footsteps. So what I wanted to do from the very beginning was create like a cauldron, a melting pot, Anne's life and the court and the society she lived in, and create this wonderful melting pot where I could bring together lots of different strands. So in the process of writing the book, I researched and learned everything about how, for example, Tudors would reverence each other, how they would dress, what etiquette was like, the palaces, how were the palaces laid out, how were they decorated, what was going on in the background of the characters' lives. So it was a really thorough process of bringing together as many strands as I was able and putting them in together this melting pot and then diving headfirst in as deeply as I could. And what happened during that process was that I was kind of like an alchemical reaction, really. Some new insights started to become available to me that weren't previously available. So nuggets of gold that weren't mine to hold before suddenly presented themselves. And these nuggets of gold were indeed new perspectives, new insights, new understandings. So I don't claim to have fished out a brand new fact about Anne's life. But what happened for me on many occasions as I was doing the research and began to write the story and hold all these multiple perspectives at once was that I got those moments of, oh, that's how it could have happened. It was moments of those flashes of, I didn't understand that, I didn't see that before. Now, there were lots of those throughout the process of writing the book. But when I stand back and look at LTV as a whole, and although it's actually sold as 2 volumes, it was written as one book, all in one go. And it was only ever going to be 1 volume, but it ended up being so big that we actually had to split it down for practical purposes more than anything else. So I do tend to look at Anne's story as a whole. And in fact, tonight, what I'm going to talk to you about is one of 2 places in her story where, for me, the process of doing the research and bringing all these strands together really brought quite a profound shift and change in my understanding about that particular epoch in time for her. Sadly, we don't have time to talk about both of them as much as I would love to, so we're going to say that the first one is all about Anne's state of mind in the hours preceding her execution. And I believe actually she underwent a very profound shift in consciousness in alignment with a very modern day theory on suffering-induced transformational experiences. I'm not going to say anything more, just going to whet your appetite slightly. Maybe we can come back and talk about that one another day. But there is another one we're going to really dive into tonight and focus on more, and that's all around the death of Anne's second child in the summer of 1534. I think personally, now, having written the book, that this is one of the most least written about episodes in Anne's life. And actually, I think my understanding has been, as I say, profoundly transformed by the process of research and writing the book. I think that it is probably one of my favourite parts of the novel for this alone, and for the fact that it embodies such raw emotional intensity. And I think it's kind of interesting on 2 levels, and the relevance, perhaps we should step back a moment so that I can just talk about why is the death of Anne's child in the summer of 1534 so relevant, I believe, and so important and so instructive in her story. Well, I'm not going to pretend for a moment that Anne's downfall was for any one reason. I think most historians would say now there were a whole variety of things that came together at the end that finally brought about the culling of the Boleyn faction in 1536. But I do think that for that to happen, Anne had to be vulnerable. And I think most historians would say that her obstetric history and her failure to deliver Henry, his son and heir, played a significant role in leading to the point where she was vulnerable, when all these different elements finally came together in this explosive powder keg in the first few months of 1536. So, Anne had three, for those of you who don't know, Anne had three pregnancies. The first pregnancy resulted in the birth of Elizabeth I, the future Elizabeth I. And we often hear quite a lot about that. Historians, there's quite a lot of information about that. We hear quite a lot about that. We also tend to hear a lot about the third, miscarriage, which happened in January 1536. Probably because it was so dramatic and some people believe was the beginning of the end. I mean, that's debatable, but some people would say that. And that Chapuis, Ambassador Chapuis at the time, who was the imperial ambassador, said that Anne had miscarried of her saviour. So it was a very dramatic event. But somehow in all of this, the death of Anne's second child, I believe, is almost overlooked. And it's fascinating. I don't know whether any of you have actually looked specifically into this part of Anne's story, but if I challenged you to do so, as I did when I sat down to write this part of her story, the first thing that was amazed me was there's hardly anything written about it. If you go to a non-fiction textbook to read about that part of the story, you actually find it quite hard to find it. It usually says something along the lines of, Anne was pregnant, all was going well, something went wrong, she had a miscarriage, let's move on. So I think it's really, this event is really intriguing from that point of view. For me anyway, as a writer, what's going on here? Why don't we know more? So I had all these little question marks popping up. Also, in understanding this particular part of Anne's story, I think we get a very interesting glimpse into perhaps the answer to a question that has bugged me for a long time. And I think if any of you who have interest in Anne's story have probably mulled this over from at some point, at one point or another, and that is, how on earth and when did it happen that Henry, who was so besotted with Anne and pursued her relentlessly and gave her the world, how and when and why did he turn his back on her? How did that happen? When did that happen? Now again, there's lots of debate about that, and I think Anne's obstetric history is really pertinent. Because there was an unwritten contract. That became very obvious to me, and I guess it's no surprise to any of you, that there was an unwritten contract in the relationship between Anne and Henry. Yes, he did fall in love with her, and in my humble opinion, she fell in love with him too. It was a love affair. He brought her to the most powerful position in the land, gave her everything she could possibly want. But the quid pro quo was, you will give me a healthy son and heir. So Anne's obstetric history becomes really pertinent, I believe, to this whole story of understanding her vulnerability and when and how and why Henry fell out of love with her. And I now believe that actually, and I'm not alone, I know that, for example, the late Professor Eric Ives has also mentioned that he believes that it wasn't the birth of Elizabeth in 1533, which was the beginning of the end of their relationships, which some people have postulated. And I believe now, having written the book and researched this part of her story, that actually a really key turning point, and probably the point where there was an irrevocable rent in their relationship, was actually during these tragic few months in the summer of 1534. And what I'm hoping to do is to take you back through my process of research, how I went from, and this is really going behind the story of writing the novel, but how I went from just some basic bare facts about this particular period of Anne's life, which if you like you can think of as a frame and a blank canvas, through to adding layer upon layer of understanding until finally getting to the point where I had a really rich and vivid and multi-dimensional sense of what may have happened. Now, I have to say, of course, I'm a historical fiction writer, and I use the process I've heard Hilary Mantel call creative listening. Facts were really important to me in writing LTV. Wherever I could, I tried to root the story as deeply as possible in fact. But there comes a point where there are no facts, and then we have to employ this process of creative listening to fill in, on the basis, I believe, of probability, what could have been a really likely scenario. So, so I'm going to try and recreate that story, recreate my process of learning that I went through, and describe for you how we go from these bare facts to the final story. So what do we know about the stillbirth of the summer of 1534? Well, as I say, if you go back to non-fiction textbooks, what we tend to find written is something along the lines of that Anne gave birth to Elizabeth I, the future Elizabeth I, in September 1533. She was churched quite quickly. Now, for those of you who don't know what churching is, a Tudor noblewoman and queen would, prior to giving birth, take to her chambers. She would be sealed off from the rest of the court, so there would be no contact with the wider court, her husband, any men. She would be attended by her ladies in her chambers. Doors would be shut, curtains would be closed, fires would be lit, keyholes would be plugged up so the devil didn't pinch the spirit of the baby when it was born. It was really, this was in the height of summer as well, really claustrophobic stuff. And she would stay there usually for 4 or 6 weeks prior to the birth of the child. She would give birth, and she'd probably be there for another sort of 4 or 6 weeks afterwards. Then there would be a religious ceremony called churching, where she would be purified. And having been purified, she would then be ready to re-enter society and re-enter her husband's bed. Now, it seems Henry was in a rush, because Anne was churched quite quickly, perhaps more quickly than would usually be the case. He obviously wanted to get back to the business of creating heirs. And luckily for Anne, the next fact we know is that she conceived very quickly. So, within probably about 6 weeks, she was pregnant again, which must have been a huge relief for her at the time. Certainly by Christmas, they knew she was pregnant. Then the next bit of contemporary evidence we have is a letter, which you will find in letters and papers of Henry VIII. And it says, it's around sort of April, May time of 1534. And it says, the Queen hath a goodly belly. So obviously she was visibly pregnant. So if we quickly work the dates, she was probably about 5 months, something along those lines. And that would work nicely with what we know. And then we have this really crucial letter that comes up on the 28th of June. And it says, the King and Queen are merry at Hampton Court. Wow, I thought. Now, I'm going to hold my hands up here. I've read Amberlynn's story over the years, over and over and over again. And I have never, and you guys all might be ahead of me, but I have never fully appreciated that Anne lost her child when she was about 8 months pregnant. And that's probably because I think when it's written about in non-fiction textbooks, it's often referred to as a miscarriage. Anne had a miscarriage. Now, I don't know whether you know, but my original profession was a doctor. So I'm medically trained, and my medical mind was immediately to lose a child 7 to 8 months is technically, in medical terms, not a miscarriage. A miscarriage occurs up to, I think it's 24 weeks. So this was a stillbirth of a child at near full term. And immediately, to a writer, this changed the whole paradigm for me. And I became immediately absorbed in, so what happened? Because I didn't know the answer to this because I was never an obstetrician, apart from a few weeks when you deliver 10 babies and you have to get them all signed off, so I've done it. So I didn't know the answer to the question, but I knew enough that the cause of statistically speaking, the causes of a miscarriage are fundamentally different to the causes of a stillbirth. So I ended up speaking to a consultant obstetrician, and we chatted about this period, and I said, what do you think? And he confirmed my suspicions that most, statistically speaking, the most common cause of a miscarriage is a genetic abnormality. And that's probably what happened to Anne in her final miscarriage in January 1536, and there is even sort of suggestions that that fetus may have been deformed. But the cause of a stillbirth is what is called placental abruption. So this is where, usually, the cause is not always known, but usually by some degree of trauma there is a separation of the placental lining from the lining of the uterus for the placenta. And the bleeding happens, and the two are peeled apart, and as a clot forms, the baby's blood supply is cut off gradually by degree, and if the bleeding is significant enough, then that will result in the baby suffocating and dying in utero. So for a historical fiction writer, that's quite interesting. Now I will say, there were quite a lot of, when I mentioned this theory and said, okay, we cannot prove that this happened. This is just statistically what statistically most likely might have happened. One of my lovely Facebook fans says, was she pushed? I was like, no, I don't want to create controversy here. It could have been something very minor. A trip or a stumble, or she could have just gone into labour and it happened during labour. And then it might not have happened at all, but we're talking about, again, we're back into sort of probability. So now I've gone from just knowing that she lost a child in the summer of 1534 to visualising a queen who was on the verge. She must have been excited, if not nervous, so close to success in delivering a healthy child. And yet, at this very late stage in pregnancy, something happens and she loses that child. Now, the next question I wanted to know in terms of writing the book was, where did this happen? And here the plot gets even more interesting. I referred before about the letter that is written about the king and queen were merry at Hampton Court. Well, 5 days after that letter was written, Henry leaves Hampton Court and he takes off to a palace called the Moor in Hertfordshire. And he calls to him Cromwell and the Duke of Norfolk. And within a day or two, the decision has been made to cancel the forthcoming trip to Calais, which had been planned for that autumn. It was going to be a repeat of an earlier, very triumphant trip that Henry and Anne had undertaken to Calais in 1532. George Boleyn, Amberlynn's brother, was dispatched to go and give the news to Margaret of Navarre that it was going to be delayed until the following year. The reason? That Anne was too heavily pregnant to travel, and she didn't want Henry to leave her. Now, I have to confess, there are some parts, or there were some parts in writing the book where things just didn't feel right. You just smelt a rat. And that excuse to me was this is how it felt for me very strongly, that it was a face-saving exercise. And here I have to say I kind of agree with Retha Warnicker. Now, I don't agree with everything that Retha Warnicker has written, but she actually gives the most interesting theory about what happened here. And she says that she believes that somewhere between the 28th of June and the 3rd of July, this stillbirth happened, and that Henry left. Now, we know that Anne was not with Henry on account of a letter that comes at the end of July, so a month later. And the letter from a courtier of the time is saying that the king, who was being busy on progress, he went to the moor in Hertfordshire, he went to Eltham, and went to, I think, Farnham and Woking, is due to meet with the Queen at Guildford. They had been apart for a month. By this time, I'm getting a really sort of tragic feel about what could have just happened here. Did Anne give birth late June, early July? Was Henry so devastated that he had to leave her and remain apart from her for a whole month? It was the single longest period of their separation since the Blackfriars trial in 1528. They'd never been apart for so long. I started to wonder if Anne had been left behind at Hampton Court grieving, devastated, afraid. She must have felt the king's cold shoulder. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what happened? Well, the only next letter, contemporary letter we have, is, or mention of this Anne's state of pregnancy, is Chapuis again, later in September, when he is saying that the Queen no longer appears to be pregnant, and the king is now doubting whether she was ever pregnant in the first place. So another sort of, one can imagine Henry, a devastated king, absolutely at his wit's end, taking off, unable to face King Francis of France, who was going to see in Calais, who was younger than Henry but already had 3 healthy sons. One might begin to understand why he might not want to present himself if Anne had just lost a child at such a late stage. So I'm still building up the picture. I've gone from just knowing that she happened to lose a child to seeing how we have this late stage death. We've got potentially where they were, an idea of maybe what could have happened and what the ramifications might be. But there was one final piece of this jigsaw that I just had to know about, and that was what was the psychological impact of this on Anne, of actually giving birth to a stillborn child at near term. What would she have experienced psychologically and physically? Thankfully, this is not something I've ever had to experience for myself. So this is one of those moments where I write through, how do you get close to that experience? I spoke to, at length, a counsellor for SANS, which is a stillbirth and neonatal death society. And Erica was brilliant, and we spent a long time talking about this. And she started to fill in this final gap for me about what did Anne really go through. And this is what really made it personal. Because you could argue, did it happen at Hampton Court or not? Did Henry leave Anne or not? Was it a placental abruption or not? But you can't get away from the fact that she did give birth to a fully formed child. Now clearly, she must have been devastated. We can all begin to imagine the grieving that she must have gone through. Depression even, potentially. What is very common, and I'm going to be speaking in terms of commonalities now, for women experiencing this type of event, was that common things would be that with the depression may come physical symptoms, insomnia, loss of weight, withdrawal from the world. So it's very common for a woman in that situation to just want to withdraw. Now, maybe that was easy for Anne if she had been left behind to Hampton Court. You can almost imagine her. The court has left with Henry, and we have a queen in grief. Other syndromes, so there's a syndrome called empty arms syndrome, the feeling that you should be holding a child, the restlessness that comes with seeking, where is that child? Another common thing that she may well have experienced, that is indeed very common in these situations, is actually huge anger. Anger at the world. How did this happen to me? And an inability to be around women who are pregnant, which is extremely common. Now, if you think about Anne was surrounded by her ladies, many of whom endured annual pregnancies. There must have been some of those ladies pregnant. I think one of the most heart-rending things for me was to hear about how such women often feel an immense failure. And this could have not been more true for Anne. It was her job to deliver a healthy son. That's all she had to do. She'd already failed once. She'd come this close, potentially, to succeeding for a second time. There must have been enormous hope and excitement, and it had ended so dramatically. I felt hugely close to her by the time I finished writing these scenes. They were, without doubt, for me, the most personal, intimate, raw, emotional scenes that I penned. In fact, I did some of them with a Panky by my side and tears. I was like, oh no, this is terrible. I felt so, just felt her pain and what she went through. So when I look back and think, to answer the original question, did you learn anything new about Amberlynn? Well, yeah, I did. There were certain parts of her life which were illuminated for me in a way where they had just been cast in shadows before. And so, yes, I learnt a lot about Amberlynn. And I hope that anybody who's picking up and reading LTV will also be taken on a new journey of understanding and insight into her life. And in particular, some of these most tragic and heart-rending episodes. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say. So, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. Any questions?
This sounds a barn.
So sorry.
Was it the boy?
Was it the Stillbirth? Well, we don't know, which is so often the answer when you're talking about these lost periods of Anne's history. Well, there is some people believe that it could well have been a boy because of a comment that Henry made later, after the final miscarriage. He said, "I see that you cannot bear me sons."
Ah.
And on that tiny, flimsy-whimsy basis, some historians have said that pregnancy may well have been a boy. Which, could you imagine? I mean, I haven't been into the gory details of what actually, giving birth to a dead child. And in the 16th century, we were not enlightened like we are now, where parents are given the child to hold, and it would have been whisked away, probably incinerated. Sends a shiver down my spine just thinking about what that must have been like.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Why did you go into French to Little Vieux. My little girl sings French. Do you know, it was one of those things, it was right at the beginning of writing the book, and it just, first of all, it just jumped out at me. Le Temps Viendra means the time will come, for those of you who don't know. So it was just there, and for a number of reasons it seemed perfect. Anne was very much a French lady. I'm actually busy finishing a guidebook, which is a guide to all the places and artefacts associated with Anne's life, called In the Footsteps of Amberlynn. And I went over to France last year to follow in her footsteps through Paris and the Loire. And there's something about the chateau in the Loire, and you could see the kind of, the carefree French court, and you could feel how Anne had been influenced in her thinking in so many ways by, the birth of the Renaissance, which was just bursting forth in the Loire at that time. The humanist writers that were surrounding her, and you can see those play out in her later life. Anyway, I sort of digress. But I think she was a very French lady. She obviously wrote these words, Le Temps Viendra, in her Book of Hours, which is on display in Hever. I'm sure many of you have made your pilgrimage to Hever. And I love this little phrase, because for me it's a little insight into somebody's private moments. For me personally, I see her alone with her Book of Hours, waiting and waiting for Henry. God, it's been 5 years, it's been 6 years, and the time will come. She's kind of, I'm just making this up, this is in my imagination, but, you can almost imagine her sort of fortifying herself that this surely is going to end sometime. And I understand it's actually got a religious sort of connotation as well, which I'm perhaps not so versed with. But yes, and for all of those reasons, it just seemed like the right thing to choose. In fact, there was no other option. It was lovely because I didn't have to sit there thinking, right, what am I going to, it was just there. And in fact, I had, publishers, bless them, there aren't any publishers in the audience. So I spoke to one publisher and he said, just get rid of the title, I won't like that. That was the first thing I said. Thank you for asking me about the book. So there you go. Yes.
Obviously, through history, various characters, historical characters, are demonised according to which faction is.
Yes.
I've always felt that Anne was much maligned, and I've never understood why, having been demonised, I can understand why she was because of the Seymours and the factions there and Somerset and everything, but what I don't understand is, given her mother was the greatest queen we've ever seen, bar our own current one, and given that Shakespeare existed then, why she is still seen as this marriage wrecker rather than this hugely intelligent, educated woman who actually had her own zeal for reform as well, for religious reform, but is all the time is pushed as this, this marriage wrecker who came along and was a witch and all the rest of it.
They did a good job, didn't they?
Yeah,
they really did a
why
good
is it
job.
never, why is it given her mother was around?
Yeah.
Clearly, was her mother clearly on her father's side, or her
Do you know
daughter
what?
rather?
This is just, again, my opinion. I think because Elizabeth really never spoke about her mother.
No.
Once, I think, she was heard to have mentioned her mother's name. And she had that wonderful ring, I don't know whether you've seen it, that's got the dual portrait of Amberlynn and Elizabeth. It's an open locket ring. So I believe she really, really loved her mother, but she never spoke about her. And she certainly never had her reburied like Mary Queen of Scots, James I, wasn't it? Yeah. So I think if she'd gone to the trouble, maybe, of being more overt about speaking about her mother and having her reburied and sort of cleansing her, maybe we'd see a different kind of appreciation of Amberlynn.
Was she frightened, do you think, of doing that? Because things were still fairly shaky in terms of Protestant.
Yeah, yes, probably. I would imagine so. I mean, certainly there are, people who believe that that's the case, and you can see that, can't you? She just didn't want to rock the boat. She had enough on her hands, really. Yeah, it's a bit of a quandary, though, isn't it? It's a bit of a. I've always scratched my head and thought, God, why didn't you do something about that? Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. Thank you. Yes.
Who do you think was primarily responsible for the downfall of Anne Boleyn? Because in your first book you kind of imply that Anne thinks it's the churn of Henry, but what would you think was the main person who was
The main person?
responsible for the downfall?
Cromwell. Don't get me started on Cromwell. Both of them, Oliver and Thomas, they're my two most despised historical characters. Anyway, putting my prejudices aside, no, I think in the end it was about Cromwell and Anne, and I hastened, as I said before, I think there was a whole load of factors that came together, and Anne was just so vulnerable, and then when Anne and Thomas fell out, I mean, he played a blinder, a real blinder. When I was intrigued by Alison Weir's, I think, description, The Lady in the Tower, where she talks about him basically taking a sickie for a few days and going off and scratching his head and thinking, how on earth do I get rid of this woman? And I think, he was a shrewd man. He knew what he was doing. He timed it perfectly. And Anne was just so vulnerable by this stage. But I think for me personally, without Thomas Cromwell around to kind of, Henry ultimately, I think Henry was involved. I don't think he was, that's my personal feeling again, I don't think he was innocent of what was going on, but I think Cromwell was the final catalyst that made it all happen. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
Why do you think Anne had to die? Because when they tried to get rid of Catherine of Aragon, they just kind of sent her away. Why do you think they felt they had to kill Anne to get rid of her?
I don't think I'm going to say anything new here, but I kind of do agree with the basic kind of thinking around this, that she and her faction were just too powerful. I mean, she'd almost come back from the dead so many times, and she history had shown her enemies that there was something between Anne and Henry, and it just, it was sticky. And she just knew how to bring him round, and I guess they just feared that was what was going to happen. And it had to be decisive.
You'd never remember the order without a little divorce stipulated.
Do you think that?
Sorry.
What do you think?
I thought maybe with Catherine of Aragon, because of her family, maybe they'd have killed her.
The foreign ties, yeah.
Maybe that if she didn't have that family, maybe they would have executed her as well. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think Henry regretted it?
Did he regret it?
Because Jane Seymour was portrayed as the woman because she gave him a son, even though ironically he was nowhere near, the monarchs that his daughter was. But
do you know what I did come to appreciate and realise is if you look at portraits of Henry, there is this sudden massive deterioration in him after 1536. It is quite startling. It's like, oh my God. And I think whether he admitted it to himself or not, it ate him up from the inside. I think I write that somewhere in the last bit. I think it was like a canker. And he couldn't get... Sorry?
Turned to comfort eating, did he?
Yeah, well, I don't know. You know, these homes, you can't hear what people are saying. When we do the That's the other thing you find out when you wear things like this. You sort of go, you realise you can't, you can't reach over for things and you can't hear people properly. But yeah, I think he was never the same man. You can't get away from your actions like that. You can't just pretend it didn't happen. He murdered his wife, basically, as far as I'm concerned. And I think he tried, and I think he probably tried in his own conscious mind. It was the right thing to do, and I'm glad to be rid of that woman and Harridan and what have you. But I think there was a connection between them, and I don't think that ever left him. And I was really lucky. I chatted to Natalie Dormer for about, and Natalie Dormer played Amberlynn in the Tudors, and I was lucky enough to talk to her doing research for this book. And I wanted to talk to her actually because it was going back to that question that I was thinking about before, about when did Henry fall out of love with Anne? How did that happen? And I thought, you know what? The best person to ask for that is somebody who's walked in a woman's shoes for 2 years. You'll never experience somebody if you walk in their shoes. And she had an interesting theory. And she said that she believed Henry never fell out of love with Anne, but he fell out of faith with her. And actually it plays to what we've just been talking about that stillbirth. I think that's exactly what happened. There was this unwritten contract. She had to deliver this boy. And he gave her everything. And she failed him. And it tore him apart. But it rent apart his faith in her, but not, I don't think, his love. I think that's why he, partly why I think he was eaten from the inside out after her death.
He was king first and man second, and you have to follow that.
Yeah. He was a man of great self-deception then, wasn't he, I think, it's a really fascinating character. Any other questions? Anybody ever? You're falling into shadow.
So you actually.
You can't see me either. Oh no, that's tragic. I should have walked out and sort of walked around like this. Right, any other question? Okay.
And you showed me your sleeves. I keep getting glimpses of
Oh.
the dress underneath the
I was wondering what you were going to say to show me then. Getting a bit worried? Yes. So, my lovely first class.
Oh, yeah.
So, now, I don't know whether they're tied in. You see how they're tied in?
Oh, yeah.
So that's how they would have been. These were just false sleeves. Do you see that? They're just tied in. So they're not actually all the way up, they stop here. And that's how they have their sleeves. So you don't get into talking about costume. I just had a new gown made up. It's got all the layers. So I've got the chemise, I've got the red satin kirtle, and then this. And it's really beautiful to wear. Utterly intriguing. Fascinating. And amazingly cool. So you'd think I'd be boiling, wouldn't you, standing here with this on? But because you've got this wonderful breeze going under your skirt, it keeps you nice and cool. Of course, ladies didn't wear knickers. I'm not going to confess to anything here tonight. So, yeah. Anything else, anybody? On the knicker note, then, you can tell all your friends this high cultural talk that you've been to about no knickers. Okay, I think we'll draw it to a close. I'm going to just be hanging around for a while if you want to come and chat to me, if you want to get a book, if you've already got a book, and I can see a couple of your books you want them signing, just come on over, that's fine. The only thing I'll need is pen. Thank you very much. I really... Next one is due in the autumn.
How did you find the next one?
Oh, You don't want to look at my CV.